Welcome. I'd like to ask that you take your seats. We apologize for the delay. We were waiting for the minister to arrive, and he is on his way. So we hope that he will join us soon. We will begin in the meantime. There's several seats up here. Good morning and welcome to this 10th version of Latam Focus. It is a true honor for us to celebrate 10 years holding this seminar with all our friends of BTG Pactual to reflect on the state of the economy and business in Chile and the world. At this time, we will be joined by Minister Marcel, Minister of Finance. He is joining us for the second year in a row. We will also be hearing from André Esteves, President of BTG Pactual, Cecilia Cifuentes, economist, Andrés Velasco, economist and former finance minister, as well as Bernardo, Larraín, and Francisco Pérez Mackenna. We will introduce them later on. The last few years have been extremely full of turmoil. We experienced a serious social unrest, and it has been a very difficult time, reaching moments of violence. The escape, welcome, Minister. Our escape has been a process of constitutional reform that took us even closer to the brink. And thanks to Chilean wisdom, we were miraculously saved from a very catastrophic scenario. To this, we added a pandemic, new political and economic chaos, and it has been quite difficult. Despite this scenario of uncertainty, both locally and globally, Chile has done well. It has had an exemplary recovery. We have not had that many disruptions. The political class has managed this well, and today we have a second opportunity to do better with the constitutional reform. We hope it will do well, because a very fundamental change is that the public opinion took the side of moderation, not leaving any space for extremes. Likewise, the economy is improving in all indicators: growth, fiscal accounts, checking accounts, long-term interest, and exchange rates. Perhaps a Chilean soft landing. The minister will talk to us about this. Is everything okay? Of course it isn't. But we can agree that in 6 months, the country has normalized again, and we went from having an economy with very negative indexes to a much better situation. First, we have been focusing on how to recover this economic situation. At BTG, we have a better projection, much better than a few months ago. But one of the main issues in Chile is that we stopped growing. If you look at the recent history of the country, in the 90s, we grew by 6%, in 2000, 4%, in 2010, 3%. And the first 4 years of the 2020s will be 2%. These are long periods of time that show a decrease of the economy with lower employment and a fiscal situation that is increasingly fragile. And there have been tax reform attempts that have not yielded the expected results. The growth of the economy is only 1.5% to minus 0.5. And with this growth of 1.5%, we cannot guarantee a better situation for the upcoming generations. Growth is a priority. And leaving this logic that the economy is a pie with fixed proportions is not so. With these policies of concessions with lithium, mining, infrastructure, public-private partnership with investment opportunities and generating trust in private initiatives, it is also very positive that there are two main global trends, decarbonization and electromobility, which miraculously find us, a Chilean and remote country, sitting on one of the largest copper and lithium reserves, key minerals for these processes. We have 25% of the world's production of copper and lithium in Chile, both key for electromobility. Perhaps we should revert this trend with measures that will make the country work more efficiently and grow. It is the only way to satisfy the expectations of the population in terms of employment, salaries, and welfare. And just to conclude, and as a result of this, we have the situation of the stock market. We are an important player through our bank and broker and GTF. We see that this volume traded in the stock market, the listed companies, IPOs, and others, investment funds, etc., have changed. And we have a very strong agenda to revitalize this market that pushes all sectors of the economy. There are some initiatives to strengthen it, but the truth is that they seem shy compared to the impact of greater impacts to savings and capital gains. In this sense, in the last few days, we have read news of international banks that are unsettling. And perhaps we can also delve into this with my boss, André Esteves, when he addresses us. And this is about the 15 years of monetary extensions that we have seen with rates close to 0%. And that's because the Fed increased the rate from 0 to 4.75%, which is 475 basis points. In Chile, the central bank raised the rate from 0.5 to 11.25, so over 1,000 basis points. And what happened with the banks in Chile? Nothing. Why? Well, someone would say it's regulated. Sure, it's regulated. It's quite strict, and we know this very well here at BTG because we became a bank 5 years ago, and Chilean banking is extremely regulated, much more than other sectors, and that is good. We are subject to
que nos impone normas de adecuación de capital, liquidez.
Basel III, and beyond this regulation, in the financial sector in Chile, there is a culture of doing things right, a corporate culture that includes integrity and order. And this is very positive in our country. It is also linked to the importance of taking care of the stock market, which is robust, and this has been a fundamental pillar together with the corporate culture, which leads to the health and structure of our financial market. Thank you very much, and I'd like to leave you with Minister Mario Marcel, Minister of Finance of Chile.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning, all. First of all, I would like to apologize for being a little late. Traffic in Santiago is as you know it. I'm not sure if I should make this presentation in Spanish or in English. The slides are in English, so perhaps I can combine both. We will discuss a few things that were just said, beginning, of course, with the more recent developments that we've seen in the global economy. It's part of the context we find ourselves in. Using the metaphor mentioned a moment ago, we are trying to generate a soft landing, but it's kind of like doing a soft landing with a cargo aircraft in the ocean. So it's a little difficult to have a set floor. And we've seen in these recent weeks of volatility, we've seen impacts of raw material prices, of currencies, and the indicators of financial markets, and these have moderated throughout the week. We have also discovered other cases, other sources of concern, and in the end, we can't be sure, but we can say what the impact has been on the market prices until now and the way we see it. So what we see, given the announcements of the Silicon Valley Bank, is that the exchange rate had an increase, then it moderated, and today we are pretty much at the same peso-dollar relation that we had at the time. Today, the market, I believe, is 800 pesos per dollar. There has been an increase in the risk perception reflected in the cities to 10 years, and the assets in Chile, all shares have dropped on average by 10%. And another noteworthy change has been the drop of bonds, 10-year bonds, and this also is noteworthy in the portfolio compositions that we've seen. It's very characteristic of the noise that we are experiencing in the financial market. It's much more liquid, and it's generating an impact on market prices. As we mentioned earlier, you ask yourself, when there's issues with foreign banks, we ask ourselves, how are our banks doing here in Chile? It has to do not only with capitalization, but also with the composition of the assets. And in the Chilean banking, the assets that have a better held to maturity are a smaller number of banks, and there are some that have seen some noise, but in capitalization, we see that after 4 years of implementation of the new bank law, there has been progress with the implementation of the Basel standards, and banking has improved in general. That's what we see in the graph in the middle. The vulnerability in stress scenarios has improved. On the other hand, last year it was a very good year for banking. They had very positive results, and partly due to inflation, which happens to banks in general, and they also have the possibility of capitalizing with these new regulations. And therefore, we have a relatively calm situation in Chilean banking, but it is not merely that we need to be concerned with, but also movements in the markets and how it affects our economy.
Of course, under that scenario, it's always good to have your homework done in terms of monetary policies. We started this in July 2021. The Federal Reserve started adjusting its monetary policy rate in March 2022. And 4 months ago, the central bank indicated that it had reached an interest rate that was enough for the stabilizing effort being applied into the economy. And that's the discussion that we have today. And it has to do with the extent to which those levels can be kept and keeping the monetary policy according to the evolution of economic conditions. That's why we will look into that. And if we had to draw some time ago, a couple of years ago, how the economy in Chile should have behaved, given the enormous expansive impulse that it had in 2021, we would have probably drawn a curve such as the one that I'm showing on the left side, where internal or domestic demand starts presenting a considerable adjustment. With the domestic demand, we had the greatest imbalances in our economy. And that's a process that started, as you can see in the chart, in the fourth quarter of 2021, and it was extended during 2022. Last year, we had domestic demand that dropped quarter after quarter. In terms of activity, it was more mixed, but with the quarterly accounts that were published a couple of weeks ago, we saw that that adjustment was deeper than we thought. We had negative variations in the first 3 quarters of 2022. The most important drop and the lowest point was reached in the third quarter of 2022, and the last quarter was basically flat. And if we subtract the effect of the payment of commissions paid associated with the exit of Latam from Chapter 11, we would have seen a greater recovery, which was observed with the data of IMESEC on January. If we look at how the demand is comprised, we see that the greatest adjustments had to do with durable consumptions, which was the one that was expanded mostly during 2021. We must also say that 2021 was a year where the economy had liquidity injected in an unprecedented way. We had a combination of fiscal transfer measures to the households of Chile of great extent, with a fiscal policy that was pro-cyclical in 2021, that increased public expenses in 30% above from what it was expected, that created an 8% deficit of the product, a structural deficit of 11% in the products, and we add to that the pension funds withdrawal to get to 35% of the product in a bit more than 12 months in our economy. It's hard to imagine something even more expansive than that, that created the increase in the consumption that you can see there on the chart, especially with durable consumption. And what we have achieved over the last year, fortunately, has been to reverse those movements, and through that, reduce the pressures on demand on inflation. This is also reflected in economic sectors with a drop in activity of commerce. It's very interesting to see how the commerce has evolved during this period. It was one of the sectors that dropped mostly during the second semester of 2020, when stores had to shut down. And then it had an extraordinary recovery starting in August 2020, when the first pension funds withdrawal was passed. And then it was moderated, and over the last quarters, we see that the activity has been stabilized with levels closer to the numbers of closer to 10% above those pre-pandemic levels, after being 25% above those levels. In the other sectors, you see a stepwise recovery in terms of services. In manufacturing, it has been quite stable. It never suffered such a huge drop compared to commerce. And the same thing has happened to construction services. In terms of the labor market, salary employments have been recovered compared to the crisis. It had higher levels pre-pandemic, and whether it is measured with administrative data or through surveys, what has happened with the informal or other sectors is what you would expect during recession periods, because unpaid employment dropped during COVID-19, and it never has had a significant growth. Labor demand has suffered deterioration. When you see job posts announced on the internet, and enterprise initiatives have started going up in terms of hiring. Another important topic in Chile with this economy warming in 2021 is the effect that it had with a current account with a payment balance. On the left, you can see that it had to do, on one side, due to a deterioration experienced by the commercial balance or the trade balance that was supported with a weak behavior of exports and an increase of imports associated with the expansion of domestic demand. This is a process that is being reverted. And on the other hand, in terms of services account, it was also deteriorated as a result of the increase in cost of transportations, which is very important for our imports and services, and the drop of tourism activities due to COVID-19, which is another important component on our services exports. What we can expect from the current account with all this is an improvement once all those factors are reverted. And on the right side here, you can see how the current account has evolved quarter after quarter. And we see that with this trajectory, we're going to have a close of the year closer to historical numbers in Chile, which are deficits in current account of 3% in the product, vis-a-vis almost 10% of the product in the year that was completed in the third quarter of 2022. How have we funded this current account? Mostly through direct foreign investment that reached very high numbers in 2022. We hadn't seen this since 2014. But we must be clear on the fact that what is behind the deterioration of the current account, beyond these movements, is that we had a very important deterioration in terms of domestic savings, especially during 2021. And as that has been reverted, this contributes to its new balance. An important topic for all of us during this period has been uncertainty. Uncertainty measured with the indicators of the central bank is practically back to the previous levels of before the social unrest at a global level. Until the most recent events, there was a certain moderation in terms of uncertainty indicators, but they're still higher compared to the previous levels of the crisis. This is tempting to associate it politically with the voting process, but if you follow the events that are behind these events, uncertainty indicators are influenced by several other factors. It is not enough to say that the voting process was the only one that could explain this moderation of uncertainty. Other factors that have influenced this are the evolution of the political scenario, the surplus of fiscal accounts. Let's remember that when the current administration took over, people tried to speculate how and when we were going to go under pressure to spend more, and that hasn't happened. And although we can discuss a lot about the pensions reform, we see that the movements in the market, once the government posted all the pension funds initiatives, were quite favorable. And why? Because that reform validated the importance of individual capitalization. And on the other hand, it created new mechanisms linked to the pension system to invest in the capital market. We can see some of that in these charts. Here we have the yield on 10-year bonds. Here we have the exchange rate. There are several events that are mentioned there. I don't know if you can see them clearly, but the first one on the left is the referendum of 2022. Then we have the fiscal budget proposal for 2023. I can't see it very well, but we have the pension reforms announcement. And on the right, we have exchange rate movements, including CB intervention in July of last year. We see that all those events are associated with important market movements. As I mentioned, the effect of the pension reforms announcement, and it's well marked or explained in the chart. Fortunately, there are some other factors that have been included to reduce uncertainty. Those elements have been combined, and we have experienced periods where all of these elements have done the opposite. But here we have the expectations of economic agents. On the left, we have the expectations of consumers that show a recovery. We're still on the negative side, though, but we hope to get to a point before COVID-19 in terms of consumers' uncertainty, and that has been recovered. We have some milestones here, such as the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, where the highest level of inflation was reached. The monetary policy meetings, and in terms of the colors, we have the expectations for price, unemployment, and the future situation of the country. We can see, for instance, that what has contributed mostly in that improvement, relative improvement in terms of consumers' expectation, is the drop of inflation. And we have to be clear on that. It's something that you can see in Chile and many other countries. Inflation tends to affect the expectations of consumers more than any other indicators, especially when we experience the scale that we experienced in Chile, where we had a trajectory of many years of inflation in rates of 3%. On the right, we have expectations measured by IMSE for the different sectors. We also see improvements that are more important for the commerce sector and less for the construction sector. And with all this, the forecasts for this year have improved. On the left, we have the forecast for the gross domestic product variation for 2023 and how they have evolved over time. We see that since September 2022, the Ministry of Finance forecasted a drop of 5.5% in 2023. The market was close to 1% in terms of a median, and some others forecasted more than 1.5. That gap opened in the sense that the market forecast became deteriorated. They got to a median of 1.5%. Some others expected drops of higher than 2% for 2023. But as we have included more information and given a different meaning to the evolution of economy, those expectations have improved, and they have converged with the forecasts of the central bank. I'm sorry, the Ministry of Finance. I'm sorry, I still confuse the two institutions.
Ahora, si uno quiere...
Now, if we were to take a look at the future and understand these negative figures or zero in the BTG forecast for 2023, we need to think that when we mention these figures, we're talking about the year as a whole compared to the previous year as a whole, the average of the quarters compared to the average of the 4 previous quarters. So this is normal when the economy grows and has a few variations and doesn't really have that many differences. But when we have these leaps that we've seen in the last few years, it's quite relevant. In the second quarter of 2020, we had a significant drop. Then we began to recover, and we reached the peak of that recovery in the second quarter of 2021, and we are going to have an upward trend in early 2023. So when this happens, you see comparisons of yearly averages that are halfway in this trajectory, but it doesn't really tell us what direction the economy is moving in. In 2022, for example, we see it there with the dotted black or blue line. We see a growth with respect to 2021 because we started high up, although we did have some downward adjustments throughout the year. But 2023, we're going to start at a lower point, and from this position, we should see a recovery quarter by quarter, despite the fact that we're starting off a little lower, and we could have as well have a negative variation. Now, this is a very mechanical and simple exercise to see what would happen with the GDP for 2023 as a whole if we were to maintain the level of activity of the last quarter of 2022, and that is the red dotted line on the right-hand side. And this would indicate a drop in the activity of 0.7% in average, which would agree with the figures included in the last public finance report by the Ministry of Finance. And if we ask ourselves what will happen if the economy stays as it was in January 2023 throughout the rest of the year, and that would be the green dotted line, that would give us a growth of 0.05% for the year. And that's what BTG was explaining to us. Of course, it's much more sophisticated than this, but these exercises help us understand how much movement or leeway we have. And it's what can happen at global scale and which could affect our economy. Of course, that's not enough. We need to see what happens with the growth of the economy, behavior of investment. Investment in 2022 had a growth instead of decrease, but it was heterogeneous. We had an increase of investments related with technology, a drop in investment in construction or housing construction. There was an increase in exports of machinery and equipments. So if we look at the investments made, we see that most drops are along the lines of real estate projects. There's very few real estate projects looking forward. In energy, we had very high figures in 2022. They may not be repeated. And in mining, we have a significant flow, but we still don't have any significant new projects. So we need to be attentive to new initiatives. On the slide, we also included on the right-hand side some of the recent announcements that are not yet included in these analyses. That's what we're betting on and what we should support because, of course, we need investment in order to grow and to foster internal demand in order to address inflation. In this graph, we see that the turning point was reached in August for inflation. It was reached in August, and it has dropped by 2.1, 2.2 percentage points. And it would seem to indicate that this process will continue. Why do we believe this? Well, because part of our homework has been done in macro policies, which agrees with the demand, but also because other factors that put pressure on inflation and took that upward trend are changing. For example, food prices, energy, and the exchange rate. That is why towards the end of 2021, early 2022, we saw several aspects that put pressure on inflation, and it took an upward trend. Now we see other aspects that are moderating inflation. And on the left-hand side, you see the inflation expectation to 12 and 24 months have started to drop, and the two-year expectation has gone back to 3%, which is the central bank's goal. Expectations have changed, and fortunately, this has closed on a more positive note. This with the expectations for inflation. The inflation swaps on the right-hand side show us that the market expectations are reflected in those prices. Inflation should drop throughout 2023 and possibly during April, more probably during May. Inflation should be under 10%, and by the end of the year, it should be near 5%. So as the year progresses, activity will increase, inflation will drop, and that is all part of this rebalancing of Chilean economy. It doesn't mean that we're going to thrive suddenly, but despite the fact that we still have a lot of work cut ahead for us, we are moving in a positive direction. In the case of the effective fiscal balance, we went from an 8% of the GDP to a surplus of 1.1% of the GDP. And we hadn't seen this in a long time. And of course, the structural balance also saw an improvement. This is transient. Let's not forget that. We are unable to guarantee this. So for the year, we are seeing a fiscal consolidation trajectory that should continue, and that will do so through fiscal balances, structural fiscal balances, that will be reducing. And this year, we're beginning with a structural fiscal balance that for the budget was 2.5% of the GDP, but we already have estimates of 2.1%. That is the macro evolution. As I mentioned in the initial presentation, there's many things that need to be done, especially with public policies, and there's a series of initiatives under debate still. The tax reform, for example, which we know was about a personal income tax and anti-evasion measures. The idea of legislating the project was rejected by the Chamber of Deputies, and now we've begun a round of conversations, of dialogue with economic, social, and political actors to hold a dialogue on this subject. And we will be doing so in the coming weeks. We're also contacting the political parties. The idea is to find a way to continue with the tax reform, understanding that this is not only about insisting on the initial proposal that was rejected initially. And there is a willingness by the administration to listen to different positions, different alternatives, and to try to articulate the best possible tax reform process. And this tax reform, together with other modifications, is part of an agenda that I believe, with mining royalties, corrective taxes, etc., is part of what the government should do after the social unrest. We need to understand that there are some pending tasks. There are some things that are reaching a limit in terms of available resources, and we need to collaborate in order to find the most adequate way to raise the resources and so that the country can invest in security, social protection, economic security, protection of their livelihood, of their integrity, and the economy. Because citizens, Chilean citizens, especially those with less resources, when there's crises, when there's inflation increases, when there's an increase in the unemployment, they don't count on the resources that all of us here in this room have to defend themselves. So that is quite unequal. And what can compensate that? Well, we can have a vibrant economy that recovers quickly, but the people need to have mechanisms that will protect their economic integrity with these measures. This is why we need resources and a good social security system. The government has proposed a mixed pension system with 3 pillars, with basic benefits, with fiscal funding, with a forced personal savings system, with individual capitalization accounts, and public insurance that would cover the people and their survivors. And that's what we are looking for. So if we take away the discussion on the pension fund systems and the IPA and the IPPs, if we look at the pension systems, they need to be able to do 3 things. They need to prevent poverty risk in old age. They need to guarantee continuity of income. They need to be sustainable in time. And they need to cover emergencies. So there's no system alone, no accumulation system that is able to answer these 3 questions in itself. A system that is only about fiscal income cannot guarantee income unless we have an infinitely higher tax burden. An individual capitalization system is not able to prevent poverty in old age, and it cannot cover possible risks that arise during life. An insurance system is not able to address these needs on its own either. So we need to combine all 3 elements, and that is what the government is betting on. And around this, there is a lot of space for finding options and for weighing these and finding a solution. If we don't build on these 3 pillars, we will not find a system that can answer the citizens' needs.
And in terms of the government's proposal, it includes an increase in the contributions rate, as we have for the last years, with an impact on future pensions that is summarized in the graph in the middle. Without the reform, the median for pensions can be complemented with an increase in PGU, with an increase in the yield or the capitalization of individual funds, and an increase of Social Security of up to 48%. And if we strengthen the individual capitalization pillar and Social Security invests its reserves in the capital market, we will be able to recover what was lost during the pension funds withdrawal. And this is between 7 to 10 years. It seems like a lot, but without it, it would take us more than 20 years to recover that capital market. Together with these two reforms that are the most emblematic ones, we have presented an investment agenda that contains a series of measures that are included in the tax reform that was rejected. So I hope that we can reactivate and position these initiatives that go into the same direction. We also started a productivity agenda that was done together with companies and workers with 9 lines of work. We have new measures for the economic security of people that was just passed in the Congress, the winter bonus, the electronic family wallet that is important for our social policy. We have a set of important initiatives for financial markets. We have to implement the fintech law with its open finances component that is about to be implemented. This is done through peso with the simplified internationalization of the peso through the simplified taxpayer ID number. The proposal of supervision or oversight of insurance-based companies, the payment for retailers, the component of investment in the pensions reform, the initiatives of the central bank to strengthen and provide transparency to the derivatives market. We have several topics being addressed, and with the news of the last days, it has important relevance in our agenda for this year, which is a proposal for a bill related to the regulation of the banking sector, insurance deposits, etc. There are many future outlooks here and prospects. I won't go into detail because I know that I'm on time right now. Economists are used to look at growth from the point of view of added production. We look at what can happen with capital, with work, and we have that enormous residue called productivity. So based on that, since we call it productivity, we have been used to discuss about productivity, if we should have more or less regulations. And currently, I believe that we are in a very different scenario. Today's scenario is, as it was said in the previous presentation, where world decarbonization is creating new opportunities for Chile, and not only in terms of copper or lithium, but in terms of how we will embrace this investment that we started making more than 10 years ago when we changed our energy matrix to renewable energy to transform this into a new competitive edge for our country. In Chile, Chile was seen as an economy that depended on the import of fossil fuels for decades, but in 10 years, it will be a self-sufficient economy in terms of renewable energies. So it will stop depending on the volatility of the price of oil. It will have a stable supply of energy and clean energy that is valued by market, and it is the basis to produce green hydrogen. Many times, now suddenly, our horizon expanded, and there is an opportunity that we never thought of for this country. Some years ago, there was a division in terms of those that thought that we needed to have added value on wood by building furniture, and others were saying that we just had to open the market and let everything flow and help our economy to change its prospect in the future. That is our thought for today. It is something that we can actually do, and this administration and the private sector are working on together. 75% of the meetings that I go to are with investors that are interested in lithium and clean energy and green hydrogen and rare earths. And someone nodded their head and saying that the government was working on this. We have anticipated ourselves. They will be providing their policy on lithium in the upcoming days. There will be room for the public and private sphere and for their cooperation. The same thing with the green hydrogen industry. So there is room for all. There are many things that we need to do. This administration has a lot to do, there's no doubt. But the same is valid for the different actors in our economy. To summarize, we're doing the work in terms of rebalancing our economy after the large imbalances that took place. That has to be complemented with reforms that are capable of creating a new social pact, social peace in Chile, to provide the room to produce, to grow, and to work, to improve the conditions of our citizens. And we have new opportunities in the future that we didn't have before. I hope I'm not too optimistic. I don't know. But I know that a while ago we were just too pessimistic. We were preparing ourselves for a brutal crisis in 2023. It did not happen. It will not happen. The worst from the adjustment period was left behind. And what we do from now on depends to a great extent on us. We will always be in the middle of turbulence. We will always be exposed to external risks. But what we do is what makes the difference. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, ministro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for your presentation. You have made some announcements as well, so that was a very interesting presentation. To continue with our agenda, we have the president of BTG Pactual, Andrés Pérez. Andrés Esteves. Good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for being with us today, attending our conference. Juan Guillermo asked me to talk about the international scenario. But given the uncertainty of this scenario, I think it's best if I would speak in English because you will understand me better.
We'll do a brief analysis on what we are seeing and the consequence on the big regions of the world. First, we are in a moment of relevant dislocations globally, a big financial dislocation and a big geopolitical dislocation. And we'll talk about both of that. First, on the financial side, we had basically 15 years since the global financial crisis in 2008 and 9, a moment of zero cost of capital, or in other words, interest rates globally were close to zero. Or in other terms, we had 15 years in a row of negative real interest rates. On the top of that, we arrived in the pandemic, and with the natural necessity of social support for our societies globally in every region of the world. And this, after all these years of negative real interest rates, we came with the largest ever monetary and fiscal expansion. And of course, with the pandemic, natural bottlenecks in our global economy or global supply chains happen. And on the top of that, we have the Russian-Ukraine war that I will explore a little bit later in terms of consequence. But there was a very clear economic consequence coming from the combination of these events. And this consequence was inflation. Inflation in a way that we had never seen for many, many years or many decades, especially in the center economies. So it was unthinkable that last year inflation in the US was close to 9% for most of the months, or that production price index in Germany was above 30% for many months, or inflation in UK was persistently above 10% almost now. And of course, with these new event came, of course, new challenge, new financial challenge. Of course, part of this inflation was caused by
fue la causa de una interrupción momentánea de la cadena de suministros mundial, que ya se normalizó con el fin o casi fin de la pandemia. Pero otra parte de eso no se refería a ese aspecto solamente, sino que vino de todos estos factores que les nombré. Y necesitaban una respuesta económica y monetaria clásica. Y luego vino esta dislocación donde las tasas de interés pasaban de 0 a 5% en cuanto a dólares. Estoy dándoles cifras para hacer un análisis aquí nomás. Y recuerden que hace unos 3 años más o menos tuvimos más de 15 trillones de bonos que se estaban transando en distintas monedas, en euros, en yens, en dólares, a tasas negativas. Les voy a decir que son 15 trillones de bonos que estaban cambiando de mano con rendimientos negativos. Y esto nunca había ocurrido en la historia de la economía. Y eso tuvo sus consecuencias, por supuesto. Cuando el costo del capital va a 0 y en algunos casos llega a cifras negativas durante muchos años, este es el denominador de la ecuación. Por lo tanto, algo ocurre con los resultados de la ecuación, que significa que hay algunas imperfecciones en los precios, en los activos financieros, en todo el mundo. Con imperfección no me refiero a un precio negativo, sino que a lo contrario. Probablemente tenían un precio bastante generoso. Y luego vimos un número de excesos en el sistema financiero en todo el mundo, de distintas cosas, donde Tesla tenía un precio de 1.3 trillones de dólares, luego con toda esta locura de las criptomonedas, distintas distorsiones que debían solucionarse. Y cuando se solucionan, vienen otros tipos de dislocaciones y muchas veces otros tipos de interrupciones financieras. Y esto es lo que hemos estado viendo durante estos últimos 12 meses, donde vimos que uno de los cambios de criptomonedas más grandes bajó FX, donde durante muchos años el modelo de 60-40 entre los bonos no funcionó en 2022. Ambos tipos de activos o instrumentos perdieron dinero y parte de eso fue necesario y desafortunadamente fue doloroso también y desafortunadamente no se completó. ¿Y por qué no? Porque es relativamente fácil ver a la inflación utilizándola en términos de dólares que vaya de 8 a 9 a 4 a 5. Pero no es tan fácil ver a la inflación que venga de 4 a 5 a 2%, que es el objetivo de la inflación de Estados Unidos. Y la consecuencia natural entonces de este análisis es que vamos a tener tasas de interés mayores por un tiempo ya en los mercados globales.
of number
Entonces estamos viendo una recuperación de los números a cifras mejores. Nos gusta decir que cuando el costo de los sueños van a cero, luego se pasan al infinito. Es una división por cero clásica, no tiene nada de sofisticado, es más bien matemático que económico. Y estos excesos ahora vuelven a la realidad. La gente pregunta al respecto de estas crisis económicas. El ministro Marcel nos comentó algunas cosas al respecto y tiene que ver con el sistema bancario en Occidente, en Europa, y simplemente son excesos financieros que se están normalizando. Por ejemplo, lo que ocurrió con el banco de Silicon Valley, que quebró, fue relativamente fácil de entender. Ellos fueron muy exitosos en atraer los depósitos con tasas cero, y alguien decidió que las tasas cero eran muy bajas, entonces iban a comprar activos o bonos del tesoro con cero riesgo crediticio. Y compraron bonos del tesoro a 10 años a 1.6, una tasa de 1.6. O sea, bueno, captamos depósitos muy rápido y de manera muy agresiva, a cero prácticamente, con un rendimiento de 1.6 en 10 años, pero entonces en un año las tasas se fueron de 0 a 5. Entonces las tasas de depósito tuvieron que modificar también de 0 a 5%, y el tesoro continúa en 1.6. Entonces es un tema de manejo bastante básico que cualquier operador junior en Brasil, Chile o en cualquier país que tenga un poco más de volatilidad lo sabría. Entonces, no es una crisis clásica bancaria, no hay exposición al crédito. Es muy distinto a lo que ocurrió el 2009. En 2009 hubo un muy mal manejo de las tasas, y en BTG, por ejemplo, o en cualquier otro banco, gran banco chileno, se aprendió eso en los primeros 3 meses de su empleo, que eso no se hace. La razón de ello fue la complacencia. Todo funcionaba tan bien los últimos 15 años que las personas se relajaron demasiado en cuanto a que las cosas podrían salir mal, riesgo, gestión de riesgo, y fueron 15 años de cero tasas. Entonces, hubo toda una generación de analistas, de economías que simplemente ya no conocían este concepto básico. Se conocían la inflación por libro, no lo habían visto como un ejemplo real, habían visto solo tasas positivas. Entonces, esta dislocación que estamos viendo en este momento por el lado financiero es muy distinto del tema de los bancos americanos, que básicamente fue un mal manejo de tasas de interés, y también muy distinto a lo que ocurrió en Credit Suisse. Eso fue más bien un tema idiosincrático. No fue por las tasas de interés ni complacencia con el pasado, fue un muy mal manejo de una franquicia global muy compleja que requería de una gestión calificada que no tuvo. Un regulador hace poco me preguntó por qué yo pensaba que había quebrado Credit Suisse, y me preguntó cómo quebró. Yo dije, bueno, primero muy lentamente, luego repentinamente. Es más o menos como cuando uno recibe una serie de señales durante varios años y repentinamente ya no se puede detener su ocaso. Y fue similar a lo que ocurrió con UBS, pero no fue ni plan A ni plan B, fue plan C. Y bien ejercido, el plan C habría estabilizado. No lo veo. Estamos en medio de esta incertidumbre Me parece que es manejable, como les dije, es un desafío financiero muy distinto al que teníamos en 2008, 2009, donde hubo una crisis financiera. Veremos otras, veremos algunos temas hipotecarios, otros desafíos, porque el mercado inmobiliario también cambió con esta dislocación, las oficinas están más vacías, se construyó en exceso, entonces quizá venga una crisis en ese sentido, pero será distinta de 08, 09. Y tenemos que adaptarnos a un mundo donde las tasas de interés son positivas, los ciclos económicos están de vuelta y tenemos que promover algún tipo de recesión para mantener los precios controlados. Ese es el ambiente que estamos viendo en Estados Unidos o a nivel mundial. Voy a ir región por región para tratar de presentarles un análisis más específico. Pero sobre esto, sobre este ambiente financiero ya bastante complejo, tuvimos también la dislocación geopolítica que vino como resultado de la guerra entre Ucrania y Rusia. Y a pesar de que la parte más aguda de esto es la situación Ucrania-Rusia, no es la parte realmente relevante. La parte relevante es esta nueva guerra fría entre Estados Unidos y China. No es algo nuevo, lamentablemente, en el planeta. Si miramos 10.000 años atrás, a través de la historia, cada vez que un segundo superpoder llega a ser el primero, ha habido un momento de inestabilidad geopolítica. Y lamentablemente eso es lo que estamos experimentando. China viene al alza y Estados Unidos no quiere que China tenga el mismo poder que ha obtenido Estados Unidos en las últimas décadas. Y esto está generando mucha tensión. No es una tensión fácil de resolver. Por supuesto, siempre hay una línea delgada en la cual se puede navegar de cooperación, productividad, crecimiento económico mundial, que es beneficioso para todos, pero es una línea muy delgada, lamentablemente. Las tensiones seguirán estando ahí y traerán consecuencias distintas a las que ya mencioné. ¿Y cuáles son y por qué ocurre esto? Bueno, todos podrán leer en los periódicos diariamente que los extremos políticos son la norma, no es distinto en Estados Unidos. Pero si hay un denominador común en la política de Estados Unidos entre republicanos y demócratas, es el enfoque anti-China. De cierta manera hay una disputa en cuanto a quién es más anti-China. Así que no creo que sea fácil de resolver. Por otra parte, el presidente Xi de China quizá sea el presidente más orientado al Estado desde Mao. Y esto, en parte, pone en peligro este espíritu emprendedor que mueve parte del éxito económico en China. Esto lo vamos a ver más en profundidad en unos minutos. Pero esta dislocación o esta tensión geopolítica seguirá estando presente y la consecuencia más importante de esto será la reestructuración de las cadenas de suministro. Todos aquí en esta sala somos parte de una generación que ha recabado este dividendo de la paz que vino como resultado de la caída del muro de Berlín en el 99. Y esta gran globalización ha sido una búsqueda consistente de mejorar la productividad. Y esto se ha hecho aumentando o creando mejores cadenas de suministro, buscando el menor costo. Y esto fue una mejora positiva para el planeta, para todos nosotros. países enteros salieron de la pobreza, China en cierta forma y otros que avanzaron a ser países de ingresos medios, a ser países avanzados, como Corea del Sur incluso. Pero ahora la prioridad en la cadena de suministro cambiará. Ya no será impulsada solamente por la productividad, costo más bajo, costo más bajo. Habrá otros factores involucrados en la reorganización de las cadenas de suministro mundiales. Las personas estarán mirando la seguridad geopolítica, la seguridad alimentaria, la ciberseguridad, todas estas cosas. La productividad seguirá estando en sus programas, pero todas estas nuevas prioridades estarán presentes. Y este es un escenario nuevo para todos nosotros. La consecuencia económica de esto será una economía menos productiva, es decir, una economía más inflacionaria. Y en esta dislocación también se ve una transición positiva, que es la transición verde, muy relevante para nosotros ahora que nos encontramos en un punto de inflexión en el planeta y tenemos que descarbonizar de manera relevante nuestras economías. Chile es un excelente ejemplo, Brasil es un muy buen ejemplo de energía limpia. Pero hay excepciones, somos excepciones en el mundo, lamentablemente. Este esfuerzo por tener un ambiente más limpio, una energía más limpia, también genera presión inflacionaria. Y todo esto combinado significa que tendremos un cierto nivel de inflación y entraremos en una recesión. Esto tendrá un mayor costo de capital, lo que significa menos sueños financieros. ¿Y cómo se ve en las distintas regiones a nivel mundial? Entonces, ya mencioné bastante de dónde estamos, pero también veamos hacia dónde vamos. Quizá necesitemos una recesión en Estados Unidos para equilibrar las cosas. Las tasas de interés están subiendo, pero tenemos volatilidad en el sector bancario al mismo tiempo que la Fed indicó que aumentaría las tasas, nuevamente. Y efectivamente cambiaron de opinión unos días después y ya no las levantarán. Entonces, el avión está volando, pero no necesariamente lo está impulsando. Y habrá cierta incertidumbre en Estados Unidos. No creo que haya tanto cambio en el modelo bancario, pero el sistema ya ha terminado la corrección. Los precios de las acciones siguen siendo muy generosos en Estados Unidos. Las tasas de interés no llegarán a 6 o 7, algo tan alto, debido a que algún tipo de riesgo crediticio seguirá existiendo, alguna incertidumbre. Así que habrá unas mejoras monetarias, una restricción monetaria moderada. Y a medida que las tasas de inflación suben, incluso antes de este ciclo en Estados Unidos, igual que en el Reino Unido y Europa continental, tienen que ponerse al día. El evento de Credit Suisse no marca toda Europa, tiene que ver con sobrevivencia, todos van a sobrevivir, tienen apoyo local, menos bancos y un sistema financiero más concentrado y más apoyo nacional a los grandes bancos y el sistema bancario europeo quizá menos frágil que en Estados Unidos, pero no veo razón para que las tasas en Europa se mantengan tan bajas. Es posible que tengan que ponerse al día y alcanzar las tasas de Europa. Lo que me asusta un poco en Europa y quiero destacar es esta guerra entre Ucrania y Rusia.
La mayor parte de los mercados y los activos financieros y los centros de activos financieros en Europa tienen una confusión entre terminar la guerra o acostumbrarse a la guerra. La guerra no ha terminado y no veo ninguna vía alternativa por los próximos 6 años para su término. Imagínense que Putin, con el arsenal nuclear más grande, lo pone en otro lado. Eso es algo distinto. Quiero destacar que aún tenemos que cruzar este puente hasta llegar hasta la civilización completa. No nos confundamos entre acostumbrarnos a la guerra y terminar la guerra. Ahora sí vamos a Asia. Primero quiero comentar algo sobre Japón. Japón era parte de estos excesos financieros que promovía algo que usamos en los mercados emergentes, que eran los paquetes. En vez de hacer uno financiero, hicieron uno monetario. Y los bonos del tesoro japonés tenían un cierto precio antes, tenían un tramo para eso. Compraban bonos a 10 años. Pero ya tenemos más de la mitad de todos los bonos del tesoro japonés, que crea todo tipo de distorsiones. Y dado el tamaño de Japón, no es tan grande como China, pero sigue siendo una gran economía, contribuye en gran medida a esta situación. Este año tenemos un nuevo liderazgo en el Banco Central de Japón. Este paquete de locura ya va a terminar y va a haber más expansión mundial. En China, por otro lado, ya hablamos del presidente Xi y del enfoque centralizado en la economía. Y lo que me asusta un poco de la economía china es la fuerza del sector empresarial, especialmente en la tecnología, la innovación. La mayor parte de los emprendedores de mi edad en China ya se jubilaron. Tal vez la otra opción no es muy buena. Las empresas ya no pueden dirigirse al IPO, a su negocio en Estados Unidos. Cada vez más estamos dividiendo dos sectores fiscales distintos, el de Estados Unidos y el liderado por China. Tenemos dos sectores de tecnología, perdón. Ya no está entre Rusia y Estados Unidos, ahora estamos viendo Estados Unidos y China. Y en el mediano o corto plazo va a tener grandes beneficios para países como Chile o Brasil. Va a haber una apertura para ver la consecuencia de esto. Esto es lo que sucede en Europa, en Estados Unidos, en Chile y en Brasil. Y va a haber un momento en un aumento en el consumo, donde van a haber mayores precios de los commodities. Tenemos que entender qué va a pasar y qué es lo que está pasando ahora. Pero esto no cambia la discusión subyacente que hay en China. ¿Qué va a pasar después? Ellos siguen con una burbuja inmobiliaria, siguen con una economía centralizada que está cada vez más centralizada. Tomaron Hong Kong de una manera muy distinta a lo que la gente hubiese imaginado 5 o 10 años atrás. Este sigue siendo un cuento sin relatar. He escuchado de muchas incertidumbres en Estados Unidos, en Europa, China o Japón. Pero ahora quiero hablar acerca de Latinoamérica dentro de este escenario negativo. Si nos remontamos a la historia, todas las desarticulaciones geopolíticas tienen ganadores y perdedores, sin importar lo malo que era el escenario en general. Y el más destacable es Estados Unidos en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Creo que aquí, afortunadamente para todos nosotros, Latinoamérica va a ser un ganador en este escenario desarticulado. Estamos en una región geopolítica del sur Pacífico, tenemos buenas relaciones con Estados Unidos, Europa, con China, hacemos negocios con ellos, no tenemos problemas y tenemos cosas únicas. Por ejemplo, somos uno de los productores de commodities más grandes, pero no solamente commodities. Digamos que tenemos a los productores de alimentos más grandes de todo el mundo, los exportadores de alimentos más grandes de todo el mundo y a los productores de energía limpia en todo el mundo. Si combinamos todos estos factores, se crea una ventaja bastante positiva para Latinoamérica. Y en términos de lo que está bien o mal, la historia ya nos ha enseñado esto con bastante claridad. Las formas de moverse económica y políticamente, y creo que nuestra sociedad está preparada para hacerlo. La sociedad chilena dio un gran ejemplo de ello en los últimos 12 meses. Incluso en este mundo más salvaje, más negativo, creo que en Latinoamérica nuestros países tienen todas las condiciones para producir un mejor futuro para nuestras sociedades. Muchas gracias por estar aquí nuevamente. Thank you very much, André, for your interesting comments and your points of view on the regions of the world in terms of economy and business. Well,
Presento a los invitados a nuestro panel. En primer lugar, a Cecilia Cifuentes. Cecilia es economista, directora del Centro de Estudios Financieros del S Business School. Gracias, Cecilia, por acompañarnos. También tenemos a Bernardo Larraín. Bernardo es vicepresidente de CMPC, vicepresidente de Colbún, ¿no es cierto?, presidente del think tank Pivotes y expresidente de Sofofa. Gracias, Bernardo, por acompañarnos. También Francisco Pérez Mackenna. Francisco es gerente general de Quiñenco, ¿no es cierto?, y ya sea presidente o director de todas las empresas del Grupo Luxich. La Sudamericana de Vapores, del Banco de Chile, de SAAM, de ENEX y CCU. Gracias, Francisco, por acompañarnos. Y por último, Andrés Velasco. Andrés es, como todos saben, ex ministro de Hacienda de Chile y actualmente decano de la Facultad de Políticas Públicas de London School of Economics. El panel va a ser dirigido...
of economics. The panel will be led by our journalist, Connie Stipicic. Are you there? So the floor is yours, Connie. Thank you very much.
Ahí sí. ¿Cómo están? Buenos días. ¿Se escucha bien, verdad? Ya. Señores, qué gusto tenerlos aquí. Hay una mezcla de las cosas que acabamos de escuchar junto con las que dijo también el ministro Mario Marcel. Yo quisiera preguntarle, porque la idea es que nos enfoquemos un poquitito, obviamente, en algunos elementos de la perspectiva global, pero también hacer algo del focus en Latinoamérica y particularmente en Chile. Estamos enfrentando un año bien particular, un año que, según lo que nos decía el ministro recién, no fue todo lo malo que se previó fuera, ¿verdad? Uno podría preguntarse si a lo mejor hay pecado de optimismo en exceso o no, ustedes me lo dirán, pero la verdad es que la perspectiva era bastante más pesimista. Yo quisiera entender de parte de ustedes, para aterrizar un poquitito la conversación, cuáles son las claves de este cambio de tendencia que hemos venido registrando, si es que efectivamente ustedes están de acuerdo con que hay un cambio de tendencia. ¿Y en qué ámbito está ese cambio? ¿Solamente en lo económico o también ustedes podrían decir, hemos visto un cambio de tendencia en materia política y probablemente la oferta política con la que llegó el gobierno de alguna manera ha cambiado y también se ha moderado? Voy a partir por la mujer, Cecilia.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias a BTG por esta invitación y al menos yo creo que hay un cambio de tendencia bien importante, puede ser que no lo veamos claramente en los resultados. Yo creo efectivamente que este año ojalá crezcamos 0%, como es la proyección de BTG, pero eso es no crecer. O sea, uno diría, ¿cómo va a ser eso algo bueno? Y además vamos a todavía tener una inflación por sobre la meta. Pero yo la verdad que yo he estado pesimista sobre Chile hace mucho tiempo, desde que se conoció el programa de gobierno segundo programa de gobierno de Bachelet, porque sentí que se empezaban a destruir las bases del desarrollo. Y la verdad que después del 4 de septiembre mi percepción negativa sobre Chile cambió. Y ahora lo que veo es que estamos volviendo a algo, y esto no tiene que ver con política, tiene que ver con una mirada de cómo se construye país. Y los países se construyen con acuerdos. Y cuando partió este segundo gobierno de Bachelet volvimos a esa idea polarizante de demonizar acuerdos, de demonizar tecnocracia, de no preocuparnos de la calidad de las políticas públicas, y tengo la percepción de que fueron los propios chilenos los que el 4 de septiembre dijeron no, no queremos esa sociedad polarizada, no queremos esos extremos, queremos moderación y queremos acuerdos. Y creo que el ejemplo más claro en este minuto es este nuevo proceso constituyente que se está dando en otro tono, en otro estilo, con otros objetivos, y por lo tanto, a pesar de que todavía nos falte mucho para volver a decir que Chile está resolviendo sus problemas y está en una senda de... Creo que hemos recuperado como lo fundamental, que es la moderación, los acuerdos, la necesidad de discutir buenas políticas públicas con sustento técnico. Todavía nos queda bastante por delante, pero esto que yo estoy percibiendo, y que creo que el rechazo de la reforma tributaria, que a lo mejor se dio por temas casuísticos, también fue una buena noticia en ese sentido, en el sentido de decir, tenemos que hacer buenas políticas públicas, no basadas en consignas, no que la cuenta la paguen los ricos, buenas políticas públicas. La reforma tributaria, a mi juicio, técnicamente era mala, y ahora tenemos la oportunidad de hacer una buena reforma y lograr buenos acuerdos.
Andrés Velasco.
Muchas gracias, gusto estar acá, gracias a los amigos de Pactual. Yo quiero partir con una reflexión levemente distinta, voy a aterrizar en la pregunta de la Connie. Yo estaba en la primera fila, escuché a Mario Marcel y quiero decir que todos los chilenos y no chilenos y chilenas, por supuesto, en esta sala nos deberíamos dar con una piedra en los dientes porque tenemos un muy buen ministro de Hacienda. Manano, Larraín y yo venimos de un encuentro en Nueva York y yo decía allá que nadie en Estados Unidos y nadie en Europa puede creer que un gobierno de izquierda como el que Chile tiene al mismo tiempo tenga un superávit fiscal. Todos sabemos que es muy fácil ponerle la pata al acelerador del gasto. Es mucho más difícil sacar el pie del acelerador. Y Chile, como vieron ustedes ahí, tiene un superávit fiscal. Y esto, a mi entender, nos revela que hemos vuelto, la Cecilia hablaba de las cosas que hemos ganado y las cosas que hemos perdido. En Chile los gobiernos de centro-izquierda siempre tuvieron superávit fiscales y los gobiernos de derecha han tenido déficits fiscales. Hemos vuelto a la buena senda. ¿Están mejor las cosas que hace unos meses? Claro, por supuesto que sí, qué duda cabe. ¿Están mejor, creo yo?
Months ago, yes, because the central bank acted on time, it applied a correct, proper tax policy, demand was contracted, and this means that inflation will be dropping and that in general terms, it seems that everything is going back to its place. The second thing is that the political environment in Chile changed. I voted reject, and I believe that that was a good decision for Chile. And I would like to invite you not to think that that was it, that everything was fixed and we just need to lie down and let things flow. No, we have a lot of things to do. Unlike Cecilia, I don't believe that the rejection of the tax reform or the idea of legislating on it was a good idea. Not because I liked all the details of the tax reform, but because Congresses are there to approve the idea of legislating. And I believe that the bill that would have come out would have been quite different because the government would have had to negotiate to obtain votes. Now we will have the same situation, but 6 months after, and the discussion will take place outside of the Congress instead of inside. I don't know if it's such a good idea. but it is to keep that trend of tax surplus, small deficits that converge to zero, and Chile will need more public resources. We must say that we can, and to those that say that we just need to cut off state expenses, we know that that won't happen because we have seen this before. And regarding what Andrés Esteves said before, I must say that Chileans are a bit egocentric, and we are impressed about what happens on the entire world, but things are wild, not only because of what has happened over the last 15 days with banks, but because we have different geopolitical situations. The war in Ukraine, the tensions between the U.S. and China set us in a different scenario compared to what we experienced 30 years ago, or the last 30 years. We are in a more revolted world with opportunities that I hope we can embrace. You participate of public discussion and also in business, the business world. Let's look at the important variables that you consider of this soft landing that the minister was mentioning. And let's complement it with what Andrés said. The problems that we're experiencing in Chile are present all over the world. I travel a lot to Europe, and the type of discussion and the type of polarization is not much different from what we see here. What we feel in Chile is something that is happening all over the world. Now, what are the causes and why is this happening? Maybe due to several factors. The second thing that I want to say is that I do not share the idea that zero deficit is a fiscal responsibility. I believe that fiscal responsibility has to do with efficient and moderate fiscal expense. You can have zero deficit with a lot or only a bit of expenses. But we must look at fiscal expenses. When there is deficit, that will be taken by greater inflation, or in the future if it is financed with debt. When we look at taxes, we need to look at the expenses. And in Chile, I believe that that is the big elephant in the room. We look a lot at rates, at collection, but we do not see how that money is being spent. Cecilia has an interesting thing to talk about education in Chile, how the budget in education has been increasing since the 90s, which is key for growth and inequality. But we have done very bad in that respect. And that's only an example. I believe that what we need is to discuss about the problems that the state should solve. And as in a company, when you are a project manager, you cannot give a percentage of sales. What the budget comes is to solve problems in terms of resources. If we discussed public finances from that point of view, we could start solving several problems and not have this fight against the size of the public or the private sector, because resources come from the same place, what we're capable of producing. And we can go back to growth, which is very exciting. But what we need to include in our discussion is the elephant in the room. If we are spending the resources of the public sector efficiently, because we forget that it is the main long-term source of social programs financing, and we need it for growth. It is undeniable that it is important to analyze the events of next year, and numbers indicate that there is a shift in the trends. Having said that, short terms are built with long terms. The ability of the country to reactivate that virtuous cycle between growth, social protection, and greater resilience of people, looking at it in the long term, I see a change in terms of the starting point. Since September 4th, we moved away as a country, and it led to some changes in this administration's program, and I believe that there was a newspaper saying that there's only 5% of the program being used, and not have refoundational logic that associated all the problems of the country with the structure of the system, and that to improve public education, we needed to cut off private provision. Before improving pensions, we need to end up with AFPs. Before improving health, we need to end ISAPRES. I believe that we are better off right now compared to the beginning. But if we look at all the possible paths that we can travel moving forward, I believe that we're far from that, from going back to the path that led us to growth, and we are closer to a path that is mediocre, probably not refoundational, rupturist, but it is mediocre. And luckily, we will grow in 2%. And we see how dysfunctional the political system is that is not capable of addressing reforms. When we see how dysfunctional the state is operating, and instead of thinking about the people that work in the state, 50% of directors of public hospitals in Chile are designated because they have political operators. And those hospitals where directors went through bidding processes, the mortality rate dropped in 20%. So if we have a state that works with the people that they trust in public administration, this is a dysfunctional state. We cannot have a country designating 4,000 people and then having them removed. A state cannot operate properly with that profusion of trustworthy officials. That's why I believe that we're in a path of mediocrity, growth, a very low growth, dysfunctionality of the state, instead of going to a path of reactivating this virtuous circle of resilience and social peace. When we talk about mediocre growth, the idea that solutions went through structural changes was dissociated. But we have a lot of problems that require fast track. For security, we're seeing this. For the pensions or tax reform, we'll end up in agreements that leave aside discussions in the long term, short agendas in several aspects, such as education, as Francisco was mentioning as an important aspect. We're seeing an educational reactivation after the disaster of the pandemic. So we're working basically in the short term and leaving aside long-term discussions. From that point of view, can we have a feeling of immediate change or probably deepening that unease that we experienced with all the political risks that it implies? How can we step away from this trap? Because an administration that came in promising structural changes is working for the short term right now in terms of laws. I believe that the big problem in Chile is political. And if we do not fix this political problem, we won't be able to fix anything. Politics have been working in short terms. And that's why the great opportunity is to change the political system with this new constitution. Pancho and everyone has mentioned this. The environment in which the new constitution is being discussed is better, of course, but I would also like to mention that we're talking about constitutional matters because health, pensions, and water are very important, but they're not constitutional issues per se. Constitution has to do with the rules of the political system, and I celebrate the fact that experts, and I hope that the constituent members that will be chosen in May, focus on that. What is the main problem of Chile, not only of Chile, but of Latin America. We have presidential systems where a man or a woman are chosen for 4 years, and since there is a second round, they get 50% more. Then they give a speech saying that the people have spoken, they have a great mandate, and then they go to Congress and realize that they have 1/3 of the votes. And this is a constant in Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, where the government is against the wall, in Chile, and so on. So we have governments that do not have room to govern. So that's why long-term laws are diluted and short-term laws are what we see. But if we get to a formula with a different electoral or political system, and for the experts, the electoral system needs to be included in the Constitution, will make any future governments, and it hasn't happened with President Piñera, Boric, or the first administration of President Bachelet, of which I was part of, because without a parliamentary system, you won't have much to do. Do you all agree on a change in the political system? Yes, there's no doubt about that, and I share the fact with Andrés that there is a temptation of going from the maximalism of the rejected text to an innocuous minimalism that doesn't point out anything. So the Constitution has to refer to the electoral system with precision. And from the point of view of state, we need to separate public and private administration. They will never provide a reform that restricts the designations or appointments due to trust. Do you agree on why we have to change this to understand if we're all on the same page? Andrés, Francisco. I already said it. We need a good mix of representativeness and governability. The current government, I don't know if it's more representative, it has 22 political parties, and as de Gaulle said that it was impossible to govern France because it had 200 types of cheese. We need 5 or 6 political parties with big coalitions for the government to have majority, and those political parties to be representative of the popular thought. I believe that presidential regime won't be changed because there aren't the votes for this. And let me finish with this. How can we make that presidential system not get stuck as the current? And for that, we need a different electoral system. I believe that apart from the political system, and it has to do with a political system, what we need to reduce in general in our society is polarization, because we have a very high polarization level and it's impossible to solve problems with it. When we think about growth as a source of resources, we have a journey in 2 stages. The first stage is productivity, which has to do with human capital, training in the workplace, networks, etc. And that is the path through which countries move towards the future. But there is another journey that is important as well, and it is to move from one level to another, to move from a group of countries to another group of countries. And that has to do with the quality of institutions. You have a lot, the right to property, the respect for law. I was listening what you mentioned about the police force, the respect to the public force as the basis to have some security and order in a society. That's very important to improve as well. Otherwise, what will happen is that we will end up growing a bit, but with a lot of frustration, because the countries that are richer than our country grow and the gap never closes. There is a difference of 40 times in terms of standards when comparing richer countries with countries as ours, even with the internet. And why does this happen? This is another problem that we need to solve, and it has to do with policies and the polarization that politics are leading to. Two very important topics. Education is vital. I believe that when we talk about growth factors, we have a human capital deficit that is quite relevant. Before going into education, tell me about the political system. I agree on the fact that we need to change the electoral system. This was another bad reform of the second administration of President Bachelet. We cannot have a presidential system with proportionality. We have these parties that respond to niche interests, and I believe that they have been very harmful. And we need to change the electoral system. I have heard that we have to change the rules of political parties so we have more discipline, and I believe that is also necessary. I completely agree on the fact that the disease here has to do with politics, but we have a structural problem, and you wrote a book with Cristóbal Uneos some time ago talking about the fact that inequality in Chile has a work source. And now that we saw that the 40-hour week was passed, we're forgetting that a growing number of Chileans that are not within the unemployment rate have 0 hours. Chile has work and activity rates that are very high and growing. The work and activity rate is increasing. That of women is stable. Work inactivity is growing for men, and the one of women is not improving. If we wanted to compare ourselves with countries of the OECD, we still need 1 million workers to have an equivalent to their rates. And when we look at those workers that are not currently employed, they are within the 30% of the poorest. The men's work participation is of 20%. Of those that are in work age, 80% within the young ones are inactive. And this means that they didn't even work for an hour in the week before the survey. In women, it is 12%. It has increased, and if we do not worry about this problem, I don't see any possibilities for us solving inequality if people are not even allowed to enter the workplace.
So what reform or public policy are we taking care of where the most vulnerable people should have employment? Sometimes they're not even in the labor market. It's not even about informal work. Bernardo, regarding the political system and the distances that we've taken at a more structural level and this frustration that comes about, probably due to an idealized view of change, which ends up not satisfying anyone. The tax reform, is it a threat? Or is this the time to be decisive? Because there's been series of presidential periods and it hasn't been resolved. Well, pensions. The pension system or the pension reform has been discussed for 15 years. It needs to be resolved. And it's a matter of responsibility that for this to have a happy ending. All those of us who are in the public sector need to work together in order to find a solution. And in terms of the tax pact, there's a series of names we use to refer to relevant differences. Then we talk about a pact, and rejection is positive because what was rejected was a reform, not a pact with serious design issues. So I believe we need to put a pact at the table, and it needs to include spending more efficiently. And that means we need to modernize public administration. And it's not, well, I think it was positive that the reform was rejected because it had serious design issues. Just a reference, there's two leftist leaders, one very extreme, one more of a social democrat. they were defending these reforms, the tax and pension reforms. They weren't talking about national accounts, distribution. Manuel López Obrador, he carried out a reform in Mexico through the FORES, and the Solidarity Party increased public expenditure, but they didn't touch the national accounts, the distribution accounts, and that from the point of view of pensions. And the Minister of New Zealand carried out a tax reform and increased tax to 40%, and this was stressed as something impressive in New Zealand. And here we're at 44.5, and they were saying, no, don't worry, we're going to put a cap at 50, as if 50 was reasonable for a country that wishes to develop. So what is my point? I feel it was positive that it was rejected, the tax reform, because we need to begin this conversation as if it were a pact by challenging all the restrictions we have in Chile, by something that someone defined that was doable. Tax reform, well, first of all, I would call the economists. I don't know what the gap was between Chile tax collection and the OECD, because everyone says something different. Some say it's 10 points. Some say it needs to be adjusted with social contributions. So we need to fully understand what it's about to see what the true gap is. And then where is that distance between the countries that have that are fully developed, that are on the way to being developed countries? So we need to fully understand it in order to initiate any kind of tax reform effort. I believe that we need to work from the side of civil society, the corporate world, more than offering a compensation, which is what CPC did. You know, instead of avoiding this thing, which is very bad, let's increase taxes to corporations. And we have a gap of 5-6 points with respect to the OECD. So we need to challenge the perimeter of what is feasible and not just the politics of it, because politics need to challenge and help us understand what the tax system of the 21st century is, and not just follow the lines of someone who decided it was doable. You don't agree. What would you say to what Bernardo mentioned? Well, I think that sometimes we get stuck on the little things and not the larger things. And I feel that I fully agree with what Cecilia said, that employment is key, and we have not really given it enough attention. Beyond the current situation, let's imagine a pact that, okay, we'll need more money. We can discuss whether it's 2 or 3 GDP points. I would say 4. Now, taxes to corporations cannot continue to increase. Bernardo said, I agree. And there are certain taxes that are too high, need to be closed. And the fourth, we have a fuel tax system that is crazy. It's bad for the environment, bad for government account, and we need to correct it. So you take from one, give to another, but how do you configure this at a technical level? Because we have some retained earnings, and we've had this discussion more than once with Bernardo, but there are 4 pillars that I feel could give way to an agreement. And politically speaking, you said something, Connie, that we need to stress. We need to solve these things. Pensions. What are we talking about? In Chile, 5 years ago or 3 years ago, we could have had an individual savings that would have disappeared. And President Boric and Minister Marcel presented a reform that would continue to have individual savings. And everyone on earth would agree that it's good if it has an individual and government savings. And I believe that we'll be co-teaching. I'll be co-teaching with Nick Barr this year, and he said, you know, you have a mixed system, but the state part is a little weak and the private part is a little expensive, but you have a foundation. Let's fix that. Let's preserve a component of capitalization, and let's just modernize the public system, and we will again have two fundamental pillars. Of course, we need to fine-tune it. Right, but the devil's in the details. Yes, Connie, but if you begin with the details, you won't get anywhere. If you start with the fundamental pillars, I think all four of us would agree. I believe the Minister of Finance would also agree. 4 pillars on one side, 3 on the other. Then if the column has a few lines here and there, we can discuss it, but we're not that far from it. Let's just agree. So, Francisco, you may define what the level of trust or mistrust or collaboration spirit is, but we're talking about at least 2 reforms, the tax reform and the pension reform. And if we put health in there too, with the impact of the crisis of the ISAPRES today, we're talking about 3 main issues. And how welcome do corporations feel in this process? Because we need to start working on this as a country. Of course, not reaching for the stars, because then we'll never attain anything. But do you feel that there could be an agreement between the government and corporations? Well, I feel that everyone should participate in this, all corporations. But we need to understand something. Everyone has their own agenda. So careful, because there's a phrase I like very much, which is being pro-free trade is not the same as being pro-business. So we need to analyze it from all perspectives and putting on the table all the aspects that we need to work on. The first thing I'd like to stress is that companies don't pay taxes. People pay taxes. What the companies do is they collect the money and they send the check, but the check comes from the consumers or from the workers or from capital providers. So in the end, society pays taxes as a whole. And the first thing I need to look at is the expenditure, and that is the tax that is being collected. It's just being collected differently with a check that comes to the Chilean IRS with whatever income and the public debt, which we'll have to pay in the future. As long as there's growth, governments can have debt looking towards the future. So the key in all these reforms is looking at the effect it has on growth. That's why I don't like that specific tax on gains. And just a specific example, companies, corporations, put these retained earnings in their balance, and it's invested in machinery and buildings. But the stronger the technological change is, the better the flow will be for investing in new technology, 3G, 4G, 5G, or in the shipping industry. The ships will change, the engines will change, and they are investing a huge amount of their cash generation, which is their free cash flow. The free cash flow of those companies is different from the earnings. And of course, we've talked about this with Andrés, and we still have coffee pending to reach an agreement on a few things. But it's very different to look at what's going to happen as a country when and the types of companies that will be developed. The main development is in commodities, but it's very difficult with a very high taxation that other foreign companies come and install themselves here, because it requires a lot of investment with respect to the cash flow, but it's also riskier. The percentage of the businesses that fail in IT is much higher than the value companies, which manufacture the products that we buy at the supermarket. So when the tax on capital is high, it's much more onerous for these investors to invest in Chile. So corporate taxes are the ones we see in the project, but if we include risk, the expected rates are much higher, and if we're in a small and remote country, they're even higher. And if we go to knowledge frontiers, it's even more difficult. And growth, unfortunately, is linked to the increase of productivity. So we need to be careful that the reforms we make not only measure the collections of the year, but also how much is going to be collected towards the future. Many of these conversations are not necessarily ideological. I want to go to that coffee. I agree with Francisco. About tax reform, what I know you're one of the authors, Andrés, but what I least liked was the retained earnings, because it's philosophical. For me, it's equivalent to having someone try to buy a car and they can save to buy the car or become indebted. If they're indebted, then they pay the VAT immediately. If they save, they won't pay the tax. So it's as if the state came and said, you are owing me the VAT tax because you're saving and you're buying the car and you haven't paid the VAT. So it's philosophical. It's a punishment to savings. It's a signal, a negative signal. You're doing something which is saving, and you need to pay taxes for that. So that part of the tax reform was something I did not like. This will be a very good coffee session. I understand and I share that perspective, but I think it's more utilitarian. I think it's a bad business for the government. The present value of the collection will be much lower. We're running short in time, but I'd like to ask two very brief questions. What is your view of security? How much does it affect us? And how much does it affect us in this sense, in economic terms, growth, and the possibilities that we have of politics taking care of all these needs when they're fully, they're fully focusing on one topic, but it wasn't being worked on before. So that's one thing, and then I'll ask another question. Bernardo. Well, there's no doubt that guaranteeing people's safety is a minimum that any state must provide, and beyond the economic implications, we need to think about the implications for the people's daily lives, people whose lives are controlled by drug dealing. And between the region of El Maule and Los Lagos, there are many hectares that are underused. Some should be used for forestry, some for agriculture, and every year it increases this amount of unused lands because of the forest fires, etc. So perhaps we could reach an agreement in terms of defining what we're going to do with this land and why we can't develop it. Because, of course, the owners don't want to replant because they get burned down. And there is a drama that is much more transcendent than economic aspects. The forestry industry in Chile is growing in other senses, but they do still have the potential at the hand of the smaller owners to improve the use of land in those areas.
I agree on the fact that the #1 job of the state is public security. The economic impact is very regressive because for those of us that have income, and I believe that nothing damages your quality of life more than living with fear. But those that have enough money can protect their homes, their cars. We live in safer neighborhoods, but it is very harmful for low-income sectors. And I believe that this security issue has to do with the problem that we have with education, which is the loss of the principle of authority. Because to me, what has happened with public forces or polices is unexplainable. They cannot defend themselves. If someone attacks a police officer, they should have the right to defend themselves, because it cannot be with proportional force. It has to be the only way to keep the principle of authority. And I'm glad that those that are governing right now, and I see them to an extent responsible for what is happening right now, are changing their minds, because I believe that it is very necessary. I completely agree with the fact that it is key for well-being and economic growth. Continuing with education, John Stuart Mill talked about this. We need to be happy. But we also need for values that have to do with helping other people and treating them well are, as we economists say, are within our responsibilities to allow us to be happy. We're all programmed to speak, but if no one speaks back to you, you will never learn how to speak. Now, we should not only incorporate authorities with this, we should incorporate it with education, through citizens' education, through social activities in schools, to develop this ability that we're born with. And it means that when we do well to other human beings, we will be happier, because that will reduce this polarization and fight against crime and improve security from the inside of people. And I believe that that is a value that has been lost. Andrés. Security is a big and important issue. It's fundamental. And let's be honest, it did not start yesterday. We probably ignored it for a long time. The gangs and drugs in Chile have been here for several years or decades, and many of us in the Chilean elite took a long time to realize that we had to do something. And the pillar of civilization is the legitimate use of force. Without it, there isn't a republic. And I celebrate the fact that this administration is supporting the police forces. And in terms of economy, in such an uncertain world with wars, pandemics, there will be a premium associated with safe and quiet countries. And Chile used to be that way. Some weeks ago, I went to Uruguay to an event, and I must say that in Uruguay, the entire IT Argentinian industry is in Montevideo. And I looked for this information in the World Bank's database, despite the fact that Uruguay collects 27 points of the GDP and Chile 22. You can do it with technology. Mercado Libre, with a larger state. We're not talking about the 40 points of Brazil. We're talking about 27, which is a reasonably administrated country and a peaceful country. That's what we need to look for. A state that is a bit larger, but that has peace and that allows for growth. I think it is not impossible, and that's where we need to head to. Yes, that's one of those threats, not solving the security problems. And do you see populism as another threat? Are we running the risk of having someone come over and become Bukele, which is a common example here? I don't know if we will be able to have a Bukele here because of probably a geographic personality, but are we running that risk of populism? It is undeniable. There are political groups that have populist tendencies that have been created recently, and some of their leaders have large citizen support, all despite the fact that that leader did not even come to the country while he was in campaign. So going back to what I mentioned before, the constituent process, the constitutional process is important due to that. In worlds like ours, we tend to believe that this isn't worth it, that we should address the problems of the people, as if all of these problems didn't go through a well-designed policy, if they didn't go through a very well-managed state. And I believe that we need to refer to certain roles of the public and private sphere. And I believe that Chile has an interesting opportunity, that is lithium. And we have missed that opportunity because we're discussing between those that say that only the state should exploit and administer those resources. And it said that concessions didn't admit any regulatory issues because it violated their property. As Minister Marcel mentioned, there's many projects. I talked to mining companies because they're our clients. We sell them energy. They still have projects, but they need to know what is the legal state of concessions of the use of land. Lithium is the only ore in Chile that cannot be consigned. And I believe that private participation, I hope that I'm wrong, will be together with the state. And I believe that that is very bad, almost as bad as the state could only exploit these resources. That's why we have concessions. And if the state needs to get income, it has to do it through royalty. And I believe that that's why the constitutional discussion is important. We're going back to the same. Supply meets demand. In the end, the demands of people find supplies. And I believe that those programs should be solved correctly to avoid those risks. Cecilia. Yes, in the same line as before, to avoid that risk, it is very important not only to solve our political situation, but for our country to grow again. Because this all started with a demand of reducing inequality. But if we face the problem that we have with education, the segregation of the labor market, we won't move forward in terms of inequality. Of course, if we don't grow. Apart from fixing political issues, growth should be in the place that it deserves. They always say that economists always talk about growth. We do, many times. But no one could say that we can solve the social problems that we have as a country if we do not grow again. Zero chances. All social demands will be just left there if the country doesn't grow. In that scenario, we could see populist leaders come into play. Connie, you said, do you believe that populism will arrive? And I believe that it has already arrived for a long time. This country is discussing the 6th withdrawal of pension funds, so there were many before. President Boric has not done a populist administration, because if you do that, you discredit institutions, and he hasn't done that. And there isn't a fiscal disorder as well. But in the left wing in Chile, we have a populist seed, and in the right wing as well. And after what I saw last year, I'm more concerned about populism in the right wing than in the left wing. Something that could deactivate the election of May and the constituent process is right-wing populism. And I'm not talking about the Chile Vamos party. I'm talking about the populism in the right wing that goes beyond Chile Vamos. It could be harmful to Chile. Populism, I started talking about it 10 years ago, and people said, no, that's only something that happens in Argentina. We're serious people here in Chile. And for 10 years, we have been in the middle of populism. And what we need to do now is regulate. I would like to add something to what Cecilia and Pancho said. I'm quite concerned about polarization, as you are, but I don't believe that Chilean voters are polarized. You don't know how much to believe to surveys, but if one is extreme left and then the 10 is extreme right, where are you situated? Many people say that between 4 and 6. Incentives are in polarized policies. I lived it as a minister. You bring a bill of law to the Congress, and here comes a member of the Congress and says, that's very interesting, but that person doesn't appear on TV. The ones that say no are the ones that appear on TV. I had a problem with one of them once. And what happened when you had the problem with him? I think he threw a bag of sweets over my head, but I managed to miss it. We have a political system where incentives are placed in the polarizing show. But people say that they're not polarized, so there is room to contain that populism that has been so harmful and that could be even more harmful. Well, time flies. Dear guests, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you. Thank you very much to all of our guests. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you next year.